this episode, we have D. Graham Burnett joining us. And as a quick caveat before we get going, this is early in our this was recorded early in our transition to video, and so our setup was a bit marginal. So apologize for that, but that does not degrade from the quality of the conversation. So talk to me a bit about why you wanted to have Graham on the pod.
Well, he's awesome. It's the short. They're going to see how awesome he is.
Yeah, they are.
Because he's colourful, he's interesting, he's thoughtful. He's like someone who, when you spend time talking with him or listening to a lecture from him, you literally can see the wheels turn. You know, it's he's just great. And the way he phrases things is so interesting. And what I like about his scholarship is this history of the study of attention and how important that is to understand, because it reminds us yet again that so much about the way that we sort of conceptualize the world today is actually based on it's contingent on how people made decisions before us. He also has edited this great book with Justin Smith, who I just realized who also wrote a book that I really love called The Internet Is Not What You Think It Is. And so I'd highly recommend that book too. But this is a book, Scenes of Attention, is a bunch of essays that are sort of associated with how we study attention and how we think about attention. It's a deeper study than most people are going to get around to read, but you can just read one or two of the essays, and that's really all you need to do to make buying the book really worthwhile. And I've learned a lot. I have greater sort of perspective on how our attention on attention has changed and actually driven how we think about this.
And I love his phrase when he talks about how that our attention has been fracked, and the fracking of our attention into little commoditizable bits. And now I can't remember exactly how much of that phrase is directly from him and how much we've riffed on it. But it did occur to me that I've adopted that phrase, fracking attention, so much because someone asked if they could quote me saying that. And I said, yes, but I think you actually have to say that I'm referring to Graham when I'm using that phrase. But it is, it's highly colorful, but it makes the understanding of whether the impact of the attention economy so much richer and more approachable at the same time. So anyway, thank you so much to Graham for joining us, and we'll let you join the conversation now. Graham, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Dave. And hi, Helen.
Hi.
So I would like to hear you tell a bit of the story of what inspired you to pursue researching attention to begin with.
Oh, wow. I suppose there are so many different ways to answer that question, but maybe the first would be to say that I have a long-standing interest in the visual and performing arts, and had a sort of past life doing some contemporary dance, and questions of choreography and something like the dramaturgy of holding attention and moving attention around both within one's own physical body and then serving as a kind of cursor for the performative attentional encounter felt so deep and so important that I was drawn again and again to theorists, authors, writers, philosophers, who had tried to say something about that moment where the mind and the senses connect to an object or to a subject. And I'm sort of, in the end, a pretty academic guy, and so when I get interested in things, I almost inevitably start sort of studying them. It's like my own personal form of attention has turned out to be study much more than it has been contemporary dance. So I don't dance much anymore, but I do study. So I ended up studying attention.
I'm so glad I asked you that question.
I was so not expecting that answer.
Well, just because sometimes these conversations get personal. I will share that I grew up on the stage at McCarter Theater, which is, right adjacent to Princeton University, as a member of the Princeton Ballet. So we, strangely enough, both have a history of dance. Yeah, that's a little bit mind-blowing, isn't it?
That certainly is. And I mean, hey, let's go there. I was married for, 15, 16 years to an extraordinary ballerina. That was how we met, was in a dance class. She was in the Ballet de San Juan and went on in contemporary. And so I never had a real, ballet life, but did enough ballet training to be able to defend myself in modern and contemporary. And I had done that for a year before I went to college, and then continued all through college, which is where the two of us met, and had quite a life, and danced actually in the UK, and she started a dance company when we were in Cambridge together. So dance was a really big part of life for a long time.
Oh, it's fantastic. And I love your reference to being a cursor. I think that, I've heard you mention that idea in the past, as and can you expand on that a little bit more about what you mean by being a cursor and how that ties to attention and capturing attention?
It already intuitively feels like such a rich metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's both a metaphor and more than a metaphor in that juicy way, right? As our metaphors die, they become new truths, and there's always a kind of a sliding scale that elides the juxtaposition of a metaphor with the continuity of something closer to analogy. And that's a long way of saying, cue pitch for book project. The book I'm working on right now, which nobody out there can go buy, is a history of science book, because that's the day job for me. I do history and philosophy of science, and I'm interested in the history of technology too. And the book I've been working on for the last, at this point, 7 or 8 years, is a book on the scientific study of attention in laboratories. And one section of that book examines the sort of mechanisms of cueing, all the little stimuli that are the means by which the attention is, within experimental scenarios, directed, awakened, pointed, sourced. And those are cursors in a basic way. So there's a funny section of the book that literalizes the relationship between the cursor as a graphical and dynamic element and attention as a sort of phenomenological experience of the person. And to bring this down to kind of like the most straight shooting level, let's talk about karaoke, right? And the notorious bouncing ball that would ping along the top of the lyrics at the back of the most traditional sing-along kind of screens. And so that bouncing ball becomes a touchstone for me in one section of the book as a key locus of psychosensory coordination between people and screen worlds. So then the cursor emerges later as we have more elaborate user interface systems as the place where we can kind of see our agential presence in the screen world, but that bouncing ball can be thought of as I don't know whether we want to call it the original sin's probably a little too strong, don't you think? But at least
The OG.
yeah, it is the OG of our sort of cybernetic integration through forms of attention that are explicitly configured for stimulus and response, tracking and triggering interactions with screen worlds.
Well, I'm interested in let's just go straight to this from the science side. I could talk about the science side all day because there's so many things that bounce around in my feed about attention. Part of it is because I've learned to pay attention to attention. So I'm always looking for the latest study that someone says just how much of our attention span is getting shorter or has been degraded, or how there's no such thing as multitasking, but people continue to ignore that, or the way that meditators think about attention and directing and guiding attention, or the way that we are thinking even more about where this degradation of attention actually leads us from a society perspective. I've seen recent things about how the fact is that our attention has been so fracked. I think that's a term that you brought to my consciousness, that we can't actually solve problems anymore because we can't pay attention long enough to the problem. So I'm sort of intrigued about how studying the science of attention and how that's been studied in the lab is almost a bias in itself in these to the way we think about attention, versus that, I can't remember whose quote it was, but that almost sublime quote about the sum of a life is what your whole life, what your life is the sum of everything you've ever paid attention to. Mm-hmm. So there's this sort of broad mix of philosophy right down to what actually happens with experimental design in the lab that I find really fascinating about sort of the breadth of your work. So the question in that respect is how do you pull all that together? How do you make sense of all of that?
Well, let's think. I mean, on the one hand, I'm a historian in general, and specifically a historian of science and technology. So it's fun and interesting to dig in and think about all the different things that attention has been across time. Nietzsche famously says, there are no definitions, only genealogies. So let's do a moment of that sort of historicizing deconstruction. We are all now immensely concerned about our attention spans. And we have special tests like the Comer test and so forth, which an adequately trained professional can administer to you or your child to determine whether you have an attentional disorder. Now, that test consists, in effect, in playing a kind of online game of whack-a-mole. Does that online whack-a-mole game and your ability to keep whacking moles with full focus for a good long while test something? Sure it does. It definitely does. Can you call that thing that it tests attention? Yes, you sure can. Now imagine taking the Comer test, the Comer test, like down to Amazonia and presenting it to a shaman in a Yanomami community and being like, this is how we test this really important thing called the human capacity to attend. And it's quite possible, I mean, honestly, if you could get the shaman off his phone, because now with Starlink, he's probably playing Tetris. But let's say for a moment that he was like willing to engage in this as a thought experiment and sort of invoke his ancestral community. He would probably be like, interesting. This is not that relevant to life in Amazonia, because we don't have screens with digital whack-a-mole games to play. So people's ability to stay after whacking a digital whack-a-mole doesn't come up that often in our life ways. In fact, there are a host of other kinds of activities in which we engage that are essential to our social and material, organic survival that don't look anything like this. And my point in telling that kind of little story or doing that thought experiment for a moment is to just remind us of what a historian would call the contingency, meaning the it could be otherwiseness of the way we currently, in that feed you were just invoking, Helen, talk about and worry about attention. Now, in saying that, I'm not trying to assert that all those scientists working away in their laboratories on problems of attention using fMRI and fancy testing systems and all those therapists concerned to address the attentional struggles of the citizenry are all sort of wrong or talking nonsense. That would be false. But it is really valuable at this moment, I would argue in particular, for reasons I can give, to remind ourselves of how shockingly narrow and specific the thing that we mostly talk about when we talk about attention now truly is. I mean, I would even go so far as to say all our talking about attention has something of the character of like a pure monoculture. It's as if, you brought a Martian to Kansas or something, and the Martian was like, this is weird. Here on Earth, you only have soybean plants. Odd. And you'd have to be like, no, man. There used to be all kinds of stuff here. This used to be tall grass prairie with 135 different species of grasses and forbs. It's just that, and a root system that was 9 feet deep and remarkable biodiversity. It's just that we plowed that up, and what we've been planting for a while is just soybeans here. So now that's what we've got. I would argue that at present, the discourse around our attentional lives, which is heightened and suffused with anxiety, is, weirdly enough, the same kind of anxiety that Monsanto has when there's like a blight on like soybeans. It's like, this is very bad if you're in an all soybean ecology, but there's a solution, which is like, hey team, let's widen the frame and try to do some work to remember how rich and diverse human attentional capacities are. And the reason to do that kind of story right now, the reason to remind ourselves of that, the reason that I would argue that something close to human survival ends up hinging on our doing that remembering work and reminding work, is that across the last, let's say, 20 years or so, human beings across most of the semi-rich and rich world have come under a radical new kind of exploitative assault, which in friendly, like biz school speak, we call the attention economy. But Helen, you invoked the term that I would prefer and that people like me who think of themselves as attention activists would prefer, which is not the attention economy, but rather human fracking, where what you're doing is trying to make money out of people's eyeballs, in effect. Right? You are quite literally going to a human person and trying to figure out how you can hold their attention for an extra tenth of a second over here so that you can, behind the scenes, auction off that split-second deflection of their attention to the highest bidder. So we're familiar with this as the essential driver of the modern media, labor, and entertainment system. This is what drives the internet. It's an ad revenue model, and it's not like a conventional advertising strategy like you throw up a billboard somewhere. It's this very new kind of mobile, intelligent, iterative, data, capitalizing on data capturing and data activating system that is, as I know interests you all, something closer to a kind of an intimacy economy. It's about achieving a kind of closeness to our persons at all times through these powerful cognitive prosthetics that we persist inexplicably in calling phones. And that project of making money out of this quality of people's humanity, which we could just call their interest, their curiosity, their care, their ability to care, turns out to be just very bad for people. If you put trillions of dollars of capital and the most powerful computational technologies available to humankind, and most of the most brilliant programmers who can be found on the task of maximizing TOD, time on device, also notably the German word for death, TOD, you'll probably succeed, actually. And that turns out to separate people from not just each other in important ways, but really ultimately from themselves, because our ability to give our attention is the stuff out of which we make our relationships with others, with the world, with ourselves. So lots of people have pointed this out. I'm not saying something revolutionary or novel. There are thousands of activists, tens of thousands of activists of a whole bunch of different sorts: legal activists, programming ethics activists, people involved in mindfulness, meditation, folks concentrating on social and emotional learning, people who are concerned with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, lots and lots of different kinds of folks worried about what the hyper-intensification of a commodified attentional marketplace is doing to us. And I'm just another one of those folks here to sing the problem, while also speaking not just to the problem, but to some solution spaces. And that's what circles me back to that image of the prairie rather than the soybean field. Because I think it's a tenet of the attention activism to which I'm committed, and the community of attention activists with whom I work, that we actually want to be cautious about getting into a kind of fight to defend that very narrow, specific kind of soybean monoculture attention, meaning the kind of Comer-esque test attention of digital whack-a-mole. How long can you look at a screen? Can you poke that cursor when it blinks at you? Can you be cued to respond to your device? Because just to step into that ring is already basically to lose. You might be able to survive for a few more rounds in that ring, you know what I mean? Or dance around faster so as like to get less injured. But that's just always already the wrong fight to be having. What we need to be smarter about is recognizing the way that the extraordinary richness, thickness, and complexity of human attentional capacities has been thinned and made depauperate, as the biologists would say, species poor, as we've been canalized, funneled into the kind of attention I'm doing right now, where there's like a camera looking at me and a screen in front of me and buttons that the thing wants me to push. And it's actually the same kind of attention that everybody listening to this is probably engaged in too. I mean, to be honest, maybe they have earbuds in and they're trying to wash the dishes while they listen to this. But in practice, most of what we do now involves some form of cybernetic attention that is instrumentalized and tracking and triggering and based in being responsive to stimuli that appear on our screens. And as a historian, I believe I can actually explain how we got to that monoculture universe where that's the only kind of attention that anybody can remember anymore, and we spend our time worrying about whether or not we've got enough soybeans and whether they're healthy enough, instead of remembering that there's like an entire botanical universe that we might take a moment to consider on if we would just turn around and go somewhere else where some other kinds of attention can be found. Does that, you feeling me?
Yeah, very much so. And I'd love to dig into a little bit of the history and have your historian mind and reflections. I'm sort of trying to form a question that bounces around a little bit in the world of McLuhan and Postman, and thinking of the example in one of the books that one of them wrote, talking about the reflecting back on the Lincoln and Douglas debates in their presidential pursuits, and one would stand up and talk for 2 hours, and then another one would respond for an hour, and the people would sit for hours listening to these debates, through to as the changes happen with all these new medium, and what did that do in terms of the medium being the message and amusing ourselves to death, and all of the, I think of that, they're not historians, but a lot of what they talked about described what happened in history and made some level of prediction of what might happen in the future. And so I'm wondering whether that thought process is important in front of mind to you, or whether something else. But I'm curious to hear how you would describe the history of how we became to be a soybean-only attention, creatures, and where did it all go? Because it clearly, like, we haven't evolved that quickly, right? Like, evolution hasn't changed us as humans in the last 150, 200 years. So where did it go?
Well, cultural evolution goes faster.
Yes, cultural evolution goes faster. True. Yeah. But from as a biological being, why does it seem so odd that someone could sit for hours and listen to very long debates in today's world?
Well, let me give a kind of a quick précis of what I take to be the story. What I try to show in the book is that it is the rise of the experimental laboratory-based study of human psychology. Really gets started in Germany in the last decades of the 19th century and has a heck of a run in the English-speaking world across the 20th century, that drives the conceptualization of that sort of monoculture form of instrumentalized, ultimately cybernetic, meaning back and forth to the machine, stimulus and response kind of attention. And it codifies, promotes, foregrounds that kind of attention for a couple of reasons. One, there is a durable research paradigm that is being paid for, unsurprisingly, by the kinds of funders that support research, which across much of the 20th century is, not to sound paranoiac here, but just to like say a true thing, the military-industrial complex. There's a lot more money for trying to blow things up, like shoot down airplanes, than there is for studying transcendental meditation. It's basic. There's nobody who really has a pressing need to dig in on the neurophysiology of TM states. You can't kill anybody with that, really. And yet a vast percentage of the research budget going to fundamental research on humans is being driven by exactly the kinds of concerns that we're familiar with from World War II rerun movies. And so the truth is, when you dig into the archive, what you find is a vast number of laboratory-based studies that are exactly concerned with tracking and triggering. And with the forms of screen-based vigilance, how long can people stare at screens, that are at the heart of something like radar monitoring, which is every bit as important as being able to shoot down an airplane. There's sort of two things you want to be able to do: shoot things down and know when things are coming. And those two projects are rooted in a cybernetic situation, a human and a machine. And you've got to get the human looking at the right thing in the right way at the right moment. And so, as a historian, I'm always a little anxious about oversimplifying, but it's also really dangerous not to like convey the gist of the story. So for any folks who are out there listening and sort of, are especially concerned with the complexity and nuance of all things, I wish to honor you for a moment and be like, yes, it is more complicated than the story I am telling. However, if you only have 5 minutes to tell someone the story, this is the relevant story to tell. And what that story gets us is an attention that has been sliced and diced, quantified and specified in laboratory settings. And sliced and diced attention is all set up to be priced. You slice it, you dice it, you price it. So there's again a large and interesting question about why it is that the project of like modern technoscience has again and again kind of jumped into bed so happily with industrial capitalism and post-industrial capital. That's like a interesting question that one could go to grad school and reflect on, but it's not required to go to grad school on it. We can bracket it. It's just true that as it works out, all across the 20th century, there was always already a kind of slightly unholy alliance between those who were interested in maximizing return on investment and those who were studying human attention. One of the earliest eye tracking devices, about which I've written a little bit, was a system that was developed by a set of experimental psychologists, just as you would expect, people in laboratories trying to figure out ways to keep track of where a human subject's eyes were in the sensory field, and developing pre-laser, like analog technologies that made use of sort of bright lights shining off of your cornea, and then old school film cameras recording that bright light, and then you had to reconstruct from those data points, the trajectory of the eye, all that beautiful work, which is really important for like ocular physiology and other stuff like that. But who was paying for the system? Look magazine. Well, Look magazine was the competitor with Life magazine as the mainstream, nationwide consumer magazine. And they wanted eye trackers because they were interested in figuring out how to quantify the advertising value of space on the pages in their publications. They wanted to be able to say, if you get an ad in the upper right-hand corner of a page on the right-hand side, you're going to get 22.4% more eye time than if you buy an ad in the lower left-hand corner of a left-facing page. This was literally what was happening. And this was in, are you ready? This is not the 80s. This is not the 70s. This is not the 60s. This is not the 50s. This is not the 40s. This is the 30s that this is already getting going. So what I've just tried to do is tell a story about how we end up with an attention economy that can begin to frack, meaning deploy more or less invasive techniques to extract a resource. And we could like roll up our sleeves and play out the metaphor, like what exactly is fracking when we do it in the petroleum industry, and how is it so interestingly homologous with the activity of addictive feed, algorithmically driven attention economy tactics, and they're perfect, right? You pump high volume, high pressure detergent down into the earth to force the oil up. You pump high volume, high pressure detergent into the faces of human beings to get the monetizable attention up to the surface. The story of how we end up with that kind of attention, a financializable, always already instrumentalized tracking and triggering attention as the dominant attention with which we're concerned and which is available for technologically intensive exploitation, is, I believe, a story of that laboratory work largely driven by the military-industrial complex to codify, slice and dice an attention that they can measure and that they can work with when trying to integrate human beings with machinic systems.
So if it starts right at the beginning of like literally just tracking, where radar tracking, and it's about eyes, how do you shift the frame to being about this broader definition or broader capability that humans have for attention? Is it going back to dance? Is it going back to your body? Is it Clive Thompson talked about rewilding attention. That seems like a pretty small subset of some of the things that you're talking about. How does it translate into your activism work?
I love the question, and this lets me talk about the thing that I kind of care about most these days, because though the day job is being a historian of science, and I teach a course on the history of the attention economy and the history of the science of attention studies and so forth, I spend a lot of time these days wearing a kind of an activist hat. So as I think the two of you know, I'm one of the people who brought together a pretty interesting international coalition of sort of artists and writers and activists and thinkers and others who work collectively under the kind of rubric of the Friends of Attention. Friends of Attention, sort of invoking that old lovely Quaker notion of a community of friends, a society of friends. So the Friends of Attention emerged back in 2018 originally. Largely, the core group was originally a set of artists. It came out of the 2018 Sao Paulo Biennial, which was an art biennial, an international art biennial that kind of was themed around attention. There were a bunch of artists down there who had different artistic practices, including some dancers and performance artists and artists who worked in hypnosis and trance and all kinds of like really whacked out and fabulous stuff. But it was also right after the Bolsonaro election. And there was a lot of like anger and concern in Brazil around the ways that election felt it had been suborned by social media and by kind of civic fragmentation, canalization of the political community, their kind of Cambridge Analytica moment. And there were a bunch of other folks down there from all over, from Hungary and from Poland and from the UK and from Turkey and from the United States, all of which were places that felt like they were having interesting kinds of political reactionary retrenchments that felt like they were part driven by certain kinds of disinformation and civic fragmentation that was, no one could do a causal analysis that said that social media was the reason, but there were reasons to be concerned that the experience of a shared world, which is the work of attention, right? That's world building, that had sort of run on some new rocks, and that attention was a way to think about how to get us off those rocks, because it may have been a certain kind of canalization of attention that was accountable in real ways for the new situation. So the Friends of Attention come out of that moment. They work together to do all kinds of kind of interesting stuff. Across the pandemic, a lot of online work. Publish a book called 12 Theses on Attention, which listeners can find online. It's the content of the book, which is a little like kind of almost a manifesto, short, been published now, I think, in like something like 12 languages, which is a kind of cry for a thicker form of attention and for a more diverse ecology in our attentional lives. And I'm borrowing that term from the French theorist Yves Citon, Citton, Citon, who's done a beautiful book called The Ecology of Attention. So out of that attention activist work comes meaning the Friends of Attention, comes this new institution that we created a couple of years ago called the Strother School for Radical Attention, which is in real life physical school in Brooklyn. And it's a kind of a movement school. It's a radical school. It's not like a accreditation, like you get course credit school. It's a school that plants itself on the ambition for a genuine attentional revolution over the years ahead. And we understand attention activism to be teaching and learning, study, coalition building, organizing, getting all the different kinds of folks who have practices that are attentional but may not think of themselves as attention activists to come aboard and be like, wait a second, actually, like the thing I care about is endangered by the fracking of human beings. And then what we call sanctuary, which is the creation of spaces for the cultivation and protection of attention. And so the Strother School is a fun and interesting place. And I guess, like, it can sound, I mean, I live in New York City. There's a utopian revolutionary on just about every corner. So I recognize I'm like, I'm just another guy who's like, the revolution is at hand. But I'm telling you, the revolution on this one, it really is at hand. You can't do to people what the human fracking industry has been doing to us and is still doing to us indefinitely. The people just are like, wait a second, I don't feel good. I'm like angry and my like kid is suicidal and I have been cut off from every aspect of the world that I care about. And people will come and get you eventually. You can only push people so far. And I really believe that. So again, to think analogically for a moment, new technologies make possible new forms of human exploitation. New forms of human exploitation give rise to new forms of solidarity as people recoil from the injustice and find new ways to establish boundaries and reinvent themselves in their relations with each other in order to flourish. And we saw this in the late 19th century with the rise of industrial labor around the steam engine and the factory system, and then forms of exploitation that were only possible within those regimes, and then the rise of organized labor and the union movement that sort of like restabilized a new kind of labor politics. And I would argue, frankly, that we're in exactly such a moment. There's a new technology. It's made possible new forms of exploitation. It's not over yet. As I know interests both of you and a lot of other people, AI is going to extend and render still more remarkably intimate these extractive powers. But I'm just enough of a kind of like humanist that I believe that the people will not be dehumanized. And so people notice and they're like, wait a second. And they find new ways of gathering to resist. And this is already happening. It's already happening. And I'll say one more thing, which is just like a very it's a simple but a deep point, which is that every apocalyptic scenario must be conceptualized dialectically. So this is, in a certain way, an apocalypse. Long-form, immersive, textual experience, reading over, shared experiences of what used to be thought of in the 19th century as news, the emergence of news as like a way of constellating a community, because we all like read the paper together in the morning in the same sort of way, and thus had a sense of a shared narrative for our nation state and stuff like that. Historians have done a ton of work on the relationship between print culture and the forms of political identity that emerged across the long 19th century. All that stuff also, wreckage, gone. So it's apocalypse. But the apocalypse is an opportunity. New stuff is going to happen. And I would go so far as to say that we've never really had a politics of attention like we're about to start to have, because politics has never been surfaced for us in the way that suddenly now we see it as constitutive of our experience of being and relation. So we couldn't have had a politics of attention until our attention came under the kind of systematic industrial exploitation that we've seen in the last 15 and 20 years, and we're going to see for another decade or as long as it lasts. In exactly the same way that you couldn't have an environmental movement until the environment was made real for people. And the way the environment became real for people was when it was threatened. It was just natural resources to be exploited maximally at all times until everyone was like, wait a second, as we do this, our surrounds become compromised in ways that actually meaningfully compromise our individual and collective experience. And so we have to actually address the environment rather than just understanding it as like the background circumstances for some sort of civilizational project. This is, again, that same kind of dialectical moment. Attention has come under a historically unprecedented assault, and the result of that is going to be the fascinating emergence over the next 25 years of a new kind of politics and culture around attention. And there are going to be financial opportunities for-profit investors who want to make bank by spotting the trends and transformations. And there are going to be cultural and pedagogical and creative opportunities for people in like other tracks and walks of life. So I always want to emphasize that like I'm very sort of bullish on where we're going. This is good. Progress, good. Current circumstances, bad. But a certain amount of bad actually provides a nice foothold for the kinds of radical change we need.
I like the broader frame of human fracking, and you're right that we spend a lot of time thinking about the transition to conversational machines. You know, right now it's primarily focused on generative AI, and the conversations that people have with them and the incentive in the systems for the companies that are creating these systems to develop a true intimate understanding of you. And as we're having this conversation, I'm sort of reflecting on the historical lens that you bring to this and thinking about, well, you know, the parallels of fracking attention, the parallel of fracking intimacy, the early stages of inferences of, well, people like you might want to watch this show, so you might too, right? To be able to, you know, give you something that might be meaningful to you, or at least what they think of as meaningful. We won't go down that philosophical track today of what truly meaningful is, but then this sort of extension that the incentive is in the system to build a memory of you, right? The memory of your intimate understandings, your wants, your dreams, your hopes, your fears. That's what will make these conversational systems so much more effective for you, is if they have a deep understanding of you. But then there's this trade of giving it away in order to get the systems to work for you. And then what do those companies do with that intimate understanding? How do they monetize that to be able to make their systems run? And what can we learn from the history of human fracking of our attention, of what might be in the future of the human fracking related to intimate understanding, connection? Like, where does that go? And I wonder what you might speculate on. I know this is an extension of your work, but that's what I'm curious what you'd think of.
I mean, they're super interesting and extremely hard questions, on which, you know, futurists and dreamers and philosophers and maniacs have mused already extensively. So what can I add to that vortex? Let's see. First, I would say that in a bunch of ways, I think of myself as kind of an AI accelerationist. In that, I could be wrong about this, of course, but I'm guardedly optimistic that the ongoing development of these extremely sophisticated human intelligence emulating technologies that are also generative and that have imbibed, ingested, and digested the entirety of the human cultural inheritance that's available in textual form, and increasingly that's available in other forms as well, music and image. It's my guarded hope that the ability of those systems to generate essentially infinite amounts of simulacral human-generated material will actually rebound human beings from what I take to be at present, especially in learned cultures like colleges and universities, an obsessive relationship with production. It will rebound us from that distortionate preoccupation with production and return us to the centrality of, for lack of a better word, experience. So this is a kind of, this gets complicated in a hurry. And it's again, it's a little like two hits from the bong. I'm not sure how useful it's going to be to your listeners, but it's a real idea, and it's an idea that I sort of would be prepared to cash out, as they say. A preoccupation with the alienation, meaning like making apart from yourself, of human stuff, a kind of productivity model for the human being, is, I think, like wildly hypertrophied. That's gotten too big and has caused us to de-emphasize what you might call like existential phenomenology, like the highly distinctive experience of human being as such, and made it easier to forget that it's that latter thing, human conscious being, that is the only place we can dwell, and the irreducible nature of our situation. So it's perhaps excessively optimistic, but I kind of am putting my money on these generative systems breaking the back of what is, I think, already a sort of bad way of thinking about what humans can do, and possibly thereby leaving room for us to cultivate some better ways of both thinking about and doing the things that humans can do. So there's one way of responding to that, which would be like, well, that's actually a pretty kind of like conservative reaction. You seem to be, again, like losing your focus, Graham, on the singularity and sort of recurring to a sort of traditional humanism in which there are very special things that humans are and do, and that somehow this is going to permit us to gain a better, closer, nearer, and more deeply felt inwardness with that. And I guess I would cop to that charge. I would be like, yeah, that's probably right. It is that. But it is that makes me optimistic in a basic way. Now, does any of that have anything to do with attention? Yes, it does. Because this expanded and species-rich, biodiverse evocation of attention that I've tried to speak for in the course of our conversation is, in the end, like essentially experiential. So it is exactly what machines don't and cannot do. Now, some of your listeners out there are like, kind of like programmers, or they're programming adjacent, so they will immediately be sort of objecting in their hearts or possibly out loud. But wait, doesn't this guy know that the like most important paper in AI in the last like 15 years is actually a paper called Attention is All You Need, which describes like what is purportedly an attention model within the kind of algorithmic structures that generate the neural nets that can do the kind of amazing tricks that the new generative AI can do. And I want to cop again, to the fact that I'm not a specialist in this area. I don't do the history of like recent computing or anything like that. But I have read that paper, and like I guess that paper goes right to the heart of the matter. That thing that's getting called attention in that article has exactly nothing to do with the thing I'm talking about. And the idea that that could be called attention, which is not an error, you can call it anything you want, but it's as distortionate a terminological selection as could be imagined. And it is a terminological selection which is of a piece with the catastrophically deponent, scratched opponent, with the catastrophically narrowed understanding of attention that I've been diagnosing as our basic problem across this call. So that was just an aside for that person out there who knows that paper and is like, wait, no, actually, like these systems are all about attention. The answer is they're only about attention if you define attention in a way that only a machine could love, which admittedly has been what we've been doing for the better part of a century now, but that can be explained, and it does not mean it's a good idea. So that's in fact the way of thinking about attention from which we require emancipation, not the form of attention to which we must continue to bind ourselves. So I feel like we should probably round out, and I guess I want to kind of like come down from these alpine altitudes and this kind of cold and heady air, and just say a couple of like kind of basic things that I really believe and care about. And they would probably, I'd sum them up something like this. One, we need a movement. The fact that you feel unhappy when you've gone down like a TikTok rabbit hole, or indeed that you've kind of found yourself drifting into deeper and deeper intimacy with your chatbot, and you're starting to wonder if your relationship with your kids is suffering because you'd rather talk to your chatbot. Each time you have those kind of like something's off feeling, what I and like my friends and colleagues would like you to like have available as a resource is to say, Nat, shoot, I should have been more disciplined. I shouldn't have let myself spend that like 3 hours on Instagram. What we want you to say instead is, I am being biohacked. Meaning it's not like a question of you're like personally failing in your like responsibility at self-regulation. This is enemy action in a basic way. And the enemy is mammon. It's heedless greed, which has always been willing to hurt people to like make more money. That's like the oldest story there is. It's just now it takes the form of highly slick apps. So first step, recognize that it's okay. You gotta like, don't hate the player, hate the game. This is systemic and structural. And then move toward collectivities and collective action. Only solidarity will save us. Only a movement will save us. Begin to think in terms of like, where are the attention activists? Because I need my friends here to work with this. We need to commit together for how we're going to think about the use of our attention when we're together, why we're together, and what we want to do with being together, with our senses and with our minds when we're together. And this is going to happen whether you get on that board like, this week or in 2 years, but the world is going to be reshaped by people taking, in a sense, back a certain kind of agential relationship with what their attention is and how it can operate in a kind of what Tim Wu calls a human reclamation project, which feels exactly right. So that's that first thing, which is like, don't think of it as like a personal problem. Reach out and find your friends out there and think in terms of activism and collective action. And then the other thing to do is to make attention a space of inquiry rather than getting trapped in thinking that what attention is presented to you by your screen time app showing you like where you were on your device, when and for how long, in which of, the different apps that you've got. Like that is not attention. And you're getting some of that back from the device to apply to like paying your bills or, some other effectively cybernetic tracking and triggering stimulus and response activity. Get out of that ring, turn around and walk away, because that's the only way we're going to survive as something like non-inhuman beings. So yeah, and check out the 12 Theses on Attention, check out the Friends of Attention, and if you're in Brooklyn, come out to the Strother School, because there's always all kinds of good stuff going on.
We
Okay.
definitely want to do that.
Definitely.
I've just enjoyed so much just listening to you talk. And just one final thing I just want to completely make sure I understand. You talked about this being existential. Is it because it stops us connecting with others? Is it because it stopped us connecting with ourselves? What's the core existential risk that you see?
Yeah. Well, like all questions, one can come at that at all different levels. I am myself committed to a vision of the human person that's rooted in freedom, experience, something like the autonomous development of the person. You could kind of gather that up within the language of flourishing. And I would say that that requires some attention to our several and individual persons, and an attunement to the relations that obtain between that personhood and others, and to the world around us. When I say that there are existential threats presented by the human frackers, I mean exactly that our freedom, our experiential persons, and our capacities for development and flourishing are all compromised in our individuality and in our relationality by systems that wish to take what is nearest and closest to the condition of being, our capacity to care and give our minds and our senses to ourselves, others in the world, turn that into cash money and do basically anything to us to get it. You know what I mean? So the law will catch up with this eventually, but we're in a Wild West phase of all this, where it's unscrupulous characters riding in the wide open fields and running down anything that they can put some lead in. Only they're doing it to humanity. So we're gonna have to bring in the sheriffs, and they're working on that. We got some laws going. Interested listeners can look up the current status of legislation, litigation, regulation around data extraction, addictive feeds. We could talk about that, but until such time as the law catches up, and even after the laws started to get on the tails of these bad actors and folks, there's just a ton of work to do to stop ourselves from being seriously damaged. And I think we are currently being seriously damaged. I think you can look around and see the effects of that damage in people's self-reported well-being, in features of the collapse of our kind of civic experience, in the catastrophic condition of our youth in the United States and elsewhere. This stuff's real. And again, for your listeners who are out there who are up to their earlobes in the debates around Jonathan Haidt's, like The Anxious Generation, and you can find 12 experimental psychologists and social psychologists who will say that we haven't actually made a causal link between device use and youth suicide or whatever. Look, I mean, beam me up from those debates, okay? Like, it took 65 years to establish that tobacco smoking was bad for your health. Why is that? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, it's very hard to establish causal relations in complex systems. That's just the first answer. It's really hard.
Yeah.
The second answer is that when there are trillions of dollars at stake, it's super difficult to get a fragile little sprout of truth to withstand the industrial hail of resistance that will be blown at the speed of sound down onto that little sprig of truth. So if you're one of those folks out there who's like, I'm waiting until there's consensus in the scientific community concerning the impact of screen devices on human well-being, be my guest. Wait around. It'll come, but we'll all be in pretty bad shape by the time they're able to like compel your assent on that, which is ultimately what proof means. This is very tricky. And by saying that, I don't mean to like declare that like all the scientists who are doing this work are bad or dishonest or in the pay of meta. I mean, some of them are, but plenty of them are not. It's just hard to prove things that way. Step back, get big, use your intuition, see what you see, talk to some old people, and recognize that the situation is very serious. And then let's start moving to like figure out what we can do next, because that's the exciting part.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. I mean, it's been just such a thrill and a pleasure.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Really fun. Okay, take care, everybody. Be well.
Okay.
Solid state.